This is, thank you, I just got the notice. We are recording, and that will be made available to folks after the presentation. So this is a meeting, and we're hoping that folks can mute themselves. And if you would like to use speaker view, that allows you to see who's speaking in the moment. To view any captions, please click on the Zoom closed captioning on your toolbar. We also encourage the use of the chat box today for questions and comments during the presentation. APIC will be moderating the chat. We do ask that you please save your questions for the end, and we'll keep a list of them as well, because we will be leaving about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you may use the chat, or if you choose to speak, please remember to unmute yourself and turn your video on. And then again, we are recording. Okay, reminder that if you are registered and present today, you will be receiving an email to complete the evaluation to obtain CE credit. Any presentation handouts or slides will be made available on our website with the recording. And then again, we are moderating the chat. We have Dr. Baker, the APIC Executive Director, and myself, the 2021 Virtual Conference Chair, and also Dr. Voss, the Secretary and another APIC board member. So quick review of the learning objectives today. You will be able to describe the significance of having training curricula that extends beyond knowledge and to more incorporation of individual group exercises and processing. You'll be able to discuss the role that mentorship can play in addition to supervision. And you will be able to list ways in which the training program can include social justice and social action engagement to support your trainees in being agents of change. And so the final slide is, I am really excited to introduce today our highly accomplished and awarded presenters, awarded in service, leadership, global humanitarian, and DEI work. We have, again, Dr. Khan, the training director at the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology, CMTP in Boston, and her colleagues, Drs. Vibert and Moorhead Slaughter. Thank you for being with us today. We're really excited to learn from you. Dr. Khan, if you're ready, you may start, and I think you have access to share screen. And you are on mute right now.
So thank you for having us here, and thank you all for joining us. We're going to start off by introducing ourselves slightly differently than the bios that you guys have already. So I am Shamila Khan. I identify as a Pakistani American Muslim, cisgendered, heterosexual, married a woman who's a mother of a 4-year-old. And my pronouns are she and hers. And I've lived in 3 different continents, in Pakistan, in the countries of Pakistan, Libya, and the US. And I speak 7 languages, and issues of identity and multiculturalism are at the core of my personal as well as my professional identities. Pass it on to Dr. Vibert.
Hi, everybody. So happy to be here with you today. I would introduce myself as a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman, she, her pronouns. I'm of Northern European heritage. I'm married. I'm the mother of 2 adult male children. And I am a child psychologist. I identify as a feminist. I am approaching a new status in my career, an elder kind of role as a psychologist. And I am predominantly from the East Coast in the United States and very engaged in international work. I am also hard of hearing.
Hello, everyone. I'm Olivia Moorhead Slaughter. It is a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I identify as Black, African American, cisgendered, female, heterosexual, married, mother of 2 adult sons, sister, daughter of Cleophas and Cornelia Moorhead. I have Southern roots. I'm from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And I also identify as Christian, as feminist, and able-bodied. Thank you for having us. You're muted, Dr. Khan.
To keep doing that and remembering to do that. So we will be, it was intentional for us to introduce in this way. It is symbolic of how we conduct our training at CMTP, and the idea of having your personal identities be present in those space is an important aspect of how we function. Psychology generally as a field and our models within that are Eurocentric. They can be colonizing, and the idea of how do we decenter, deconstruct, and unpack this, not just in terms of our models, but our ways of learning and our ways of teaching, the pedagogy, the epistemology, and the systems of power, our training programs are embedded in systems and institutions, and there's institutional racism, as we know. And so, how are these aspects operating within our program and how they're embedded within is important. The colonizing tendency to sort of generally dichotomize and think in binaries tends to separate science and culture often, right? And in order to counter this, we have to operate in a way where we're thinking that the general skills that one teaches in regards to, what skills of a psychologist really, in order to sort of deconstruct the dichotomy, we want the cultural aspect to be a part of it. So our model is as such that we want this way of thinking and our personal identities and our ways of thinking and learning and all of that to be embedded in what we're teaching, not just theoretically, but in terms of the process as well. So in order to share all of that with you today, how are we going to conduct the rest of the time that we have with you is that we're going to give you an overview of how our program operates, what our training model is. And following that, we'll be sharing the role of mentorship. That's a big part of the program. And then we'll be talking about the evaluation and evolution of the program over time. And we'll go a little bit more in detail with some examples that we'll share. And we really very much look forward to the discussion afterwards and engaging with you all. So CMTP in general was founded in 1972 as a minority training program. And it was at the Boston City Hospital then, which is now the Boston Medical Center. And the fact that it was a minority training program is highlighting the fact that it was very much focused on aspects of race and ethnicity in its original format. And then from Boston City Hospital, it became Boston Medical Center, and Boston University School of Medicine is part of that. And the motto of these institutions is that of serving the underserved. So it seems like a setting that's fitting for the program to be a part of. It's been fully accredited since 1986 when it transitioned from the minority training program to CMTP. And the motto of the program has been mentoring tomorrow's psychologists on the path to cultural humility and social justice. 86% of our interns have been individuals from racial, ethnic, sexual minority groups over the history of the program. I think it ends up being so because over time, it attracts students from these backgrounds because they know of the work that is being done and what it may require. And we make that very explicit when we are meeting with future interns and applicants, and we highlight what this experience may be like and how challenging it can be. The The mission has always been and remains focused on training multiculturally oriented psychologists to work with inner city, low income, and racially, ethnically, sexually diverse populations. But more so, not just in terms of working with these populations, but sort of in the process, learning about who we are, what our identities are, and being attuned to those, and how they're in operation in our intersections with other interpersonally, but also within the program of CMTP, but within the institution of PMC and the context at large. So the number of interns that we've accepted into programs have varied over the years, averaging about 7 trainees annually since its inception. And we purposefully have kept it at a number that's not too high, because the kind of work that interns end up doing is so focused on their ability to engage with each other. And we want to keep it an intimate space where things come up and it's easier to hold with a smaller group of number of individuals than a larger one. We just recently, actually last week, got an additional grant, which will allow us to have several more trainees, and we have been debating on how to construct it as such that it maintains that intimacy within the groups, allowing for those uncomfortable conversations to take place in a way that feels comfortable enough. So well, how do we operate? So I know that multiculturalism and diversity, equity, inclusion, those sort of conversations are much more in the focus right now than they have been in the past, at least, when we started off as a program. And what we've done is that what we talk about is that those are the center in the program. So, so conversations that have been at the margins, very often in the training programs that we've attended, like my graduate training program, for instance, those were, there's a class on individual diversity and multiculturalism, and that's one class, or it's something that we discuss as an add-on in terms of learning our clinical capacities and skills. And so we've moved it from the margins as such to the center. Which means that it's infused in everything that we do. So it's part of the conversation in regards to all the didactics that we run. So every single didactic or seminar that we have, it has that cultural lens. So if you're having a case conference seminar, it's much more so a multicultural case conference seminar where you're talking about the identities of the people that you're working with, but more so you are the case and your own identities and all aspects of your identity that are marginalized, that are privileged, and getting people to understand that and recognize that and see how those are at play when you're engaging with others, whether it be in the clinical context or outside of that. So there are other seminars, like for instance, there is the case conference. Aside from the case conference seminar, there's a testing seminar, and how do just give me 1 second. How do we, all these seminars make multiculturalism the focus. So, so for the testing seminar, looking at all the content from with the cultural lens, who's included, who's not included, who's left out, for what reason, what the research data is, and how do we think outside of that linguistic aspect of things. We have seminars on forensics, but it's also a multicultural forensic seminar. We have a family therapy seminar that is from the multicultural lens. So how do we bring in international perspectives and models that can be included therein? So every single didactic or seminar is from within that lens, inclusive of that lens. I am going to try and... Sorry, trying to get the noise in the back filtered. And a big part of the program also is speaking about your personal and professional identities in tandem. So we do these identity presentations when interns come in. It's they know that they're going to have to engage in conversations about who they are. And we do a lot of work in the beginning phase of when we're interviewing to see that they can, they're at a place where they're ready to engage in these conversations. I remember interviewing at the program that I currently run and hearing what the program was going to be about and feeling like, I don't think I was ready to do that yet. I needed to do some internal work of my own before I came to this program because it was going to be rough. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to look at all those aspects of my identity. And this assessed in terms of not just your theoretical knowledge about multicultural models and ways of engaging, but also if the individual work has been is something that the person is ready for. So from the get-go, your individual identities are part of the conversation. So the faculty take a lead on these things. We do our bio presentations and share our identity aspects and marginalized aspects of our identity and the privileged ones that we may be blind of. We're used to talking about our identities in separate ways, but to talk about it holistically is quite an emotional and intense experience for many. So we started off and then we get our interns and trainees ready to do that. We often hear about these safe places and brave spaces and making sure that the place is safe enough to have these conversations. We do want people to feel safe, but often we wonder about who's the safety for? What are we not talking about by wanting to stay safe? So we've been moving towards this idea of like wanting to make sure it's a brave space as well. That people are saying things or sharing ideas and talking about the traumatic aspects of the identities that need to be heard and seen by others, and it's okay to say those things and that they'll be held and understood in this way. So there's a way of learning and thinking that is more in tune with who you are as an individual. And then we talk about the operations of power and we look at the systems that we are part of. How's our program situated in the larger institution? What is the program's identity within the institution? And how is that identity parallel or not parallel to what else is happening there? Is the program marginalized, privileged? At times, like right now, it's privileged, but it has varied over the history. And looking at how that's part of the system, or the BMC institution is part of the larger state, and how that fits within that. So any conversation about what's happening contextually broader than the system is part of the conversation. So we have had a lot of conversations in regards to what's happening in the world, what's happening in the country, and those are at the center on the table. We have these mentoring meetings that my colleagues will talk about more so later, but where everything that's happening in the world is allowed and has space within the training program. And we're talking about those on an ongoing basis, in addition to our own personal selves. Like context matters, and the systems within it matter. Like how does that filter down to the individual level? The representation matters. I think it's one thing to say we're a multicultural program and we do this, but I think it has to be infused with everything else. It has to be visible in who's there and who's present. Very often trainees have not had people who look like them or have aspects, invisible aspects of identity that are common with others. So we have a model where we make sure that, there's some capacity for that. And then we intentionally match interns with somebody who's similar to them and then mismatch them for the second half. So there's a lot of thoughtfulness in terms of the structure and how you set yourself up. And we have these profession-wide competencies, right, for our programs and training programs, internship training programs and other programs. So we've looked at those, and it's based on the science, it's based on evidence, and all of those factors are held. But what we have done is we have tailored each and every competency and elements within those to include the multicultural ones. So we have a program-specific competency that is focused heavily on multiculturalism and diversity, but then it's also infused through every single profession-wide competency. So it's not just a side conversation, it's included in almost everything and every way of being within the program. So what we take in is that we start with our ethical guidelines and we share those, the AP ethical guidelines and code of conduct. We have the AP multicultural race and ethnicity guidelines. And we have faculty members who have been part of writing some of these guidelines, like Sandra Matar and Olivia Moorhead-Slaughter. So we use those, and then we use those and add it to our mentored practitioner scientist model. And that ends up landing into the goal of what our program is, and then the objectives are derived from that. So I'm not going to go too much in detail with this, but the goal is that of providing the highest standard of training to interns in the culturally competent practice of psychology. And the objectives are derived from that in terms of interns are supervised, they get with supervision in traditional psychological techniques and modified for cross-cultural and socioeconomically and politically disadvantaged clients. They get to increase their sensitivity to aspects of behavior associated with cross-cultural and trans-cultural experiences in mental health, illness, and recovery, and to heighten the interns' awareness and integration of their own racial and ethnic identities. And I think, as we've been growing as a program and transitioned from the minority training program to Center for Multicultural Training, I think those racial and ethnic aspects have expanded and grown to include slowly over time sexuality, gender, abilities, spirituality, religion, so on and so forth. But we've been looking at ourselves with that eye, and we reevaluate ourselves over and over again to see how we are changing or not changing in ways. And to provide enough sufficient structure to ensure that interns achieve a highest level of proficiency in their skills associated with the profession of psychology in general, and enough flexibility to ensure that they have an opportunity to mature professionally without distorting their basic values and personal identities. It's important to hold on to those. We'll give you examples of that. I know this is all theoretical at this time, but when we train interns in the culturally competent, it used to be that we would say we're culturally competent, and we've been talking more and more so about being having the humility aspect. And we've transitioned in terms of our own terminology, and we'll speak to that a little bit more so later as well. We have this position paper, which was written in the beginning when the program was formulated, as to what is our position on training. And that is a paper that we revise every single year. It's shared amongst faculty and interns, and they read and give feedback about what's included. And it's just amazing to see where the paper was when it was first written to where it is right now. I think the very last revision of it included including the pronouns of they and them and theirs. So it's just interesting to see how the field has changed and how we've been evolving and reflecting on where we were to where we are. And we continue to do that and share and learn from our interns in that regard, because there's a lot that's coming to fore for us in that domain. It's a living, working, and evolving document. Like I said, it's collaborative. It captures the history of the program and the identities of the program, the context, the philosophy, goals and standards, and actions. And action is a big part of it because we engage in a lot of social justice activities within the program as well. And it's meant to hold us accountable. We decided to put in some pictures to sort of represent what it's like. That's our core faculty, and we have many additional faculty members, of course. And that's our current intern class with their masks on. This is our annual gathering. We have an annual gathering that takes place, and it's just interesting to see that interns from the very first intern class, 2 individuals from within that class still show up, and many, many interns thereafter. It becomes home for many. It's not a place where people come for internship for 1 year and they're gone. Many do that, but a whole lot of them stay connected. And they stay connected because there's a cultural component and kind of discussions that they can have with people who become their mentors and colleagues later on that are very meaningful. It's hard to have some of these conversations in other places, and it feels like a safe place to have those conversations and engage in those ways. So it's a very meaningful time for us. So it's an important aspect of the program that highlights the role of mentorship as well. So I'm just pointing some of the things we've been talking about, the position paper, the profession-wide competencies. We have done a lot of social justice activities. Anything that's happening in the world, we want to engage in that manner, which would feel meaningful to us. So for instance, we have all interns and faculty gone out to protest together. We have advocated, we have made videos for what was happening at the border. So multiple other activities, and every year the intern class takes up what they think would be meaningful as social justice activity, and we collaborate on that as faculty and interns to figure out what would be meaningful. Getting them to be comfortable with discomfort is a big part of the work. Allowing oneself to be vulnerable. And I think we demonstrate that and model that for the interns by doing that as faculty. And working through conflicts. We've openly had disagreements with each other as faculty about things in regards to multiculturalism, diversity, aspects of our own identity. And for us to engage in that, and for interns to witness us engage in that way and work through that, is an important part of the training. I mentioned the annual dinners. There are lots of multicultural activities that we do. We have these multicultural lunches and dinners that my colleagues will talk about later, but we've started doing Black Lives Matter panels, which have been replaced by other sort of panels in the past. We have this identity dialogues that takes place yearly, and then the quarterly meetings and annual retreats are just really a time when we look at our program as to what it was like this year. What are we missing? What's happening in the world? Are we more in accordance with where the field is of multiculturalism? What else can we do? So there's a lot of reflection that's a part of the program. This is sort of, I know that we have the profession-wide competencies, individual and cultural diversity. I know it has several elements as per the APA, but we've expanded it significantly from our own end to add additional elements. So in terms of being assessed at that multiple times during the year. So those are some of the elements that are listed, but also to know that every single profession-wide competency has been infused from our end with multiple other elements. So I was going to share the document, but I think it's refrained from that due to time. But I think the idea is to highlight that it's not one aspect of assessment, but that it's infused within everything. That's our vision. That's a way of looking and understanding and making sense of what we're learning. So it has to be naturally infused is our thought. I'll stop here, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Dr. O, as we refer to each other with our initials for some reason. There's history to that, but I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Olivia Moorhead-Slaughter.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy to be talking about mentorship. It really is at the center of what we do at CMTP. It is woven into the very, very fiber and essence of the training program. I think of it as the strong tower, the core of CMTP. It supports everything that we do from beginning to end. Every faculty member commits to this intention. And because we all understand that the role of mentorship is foundational and it's overarching. So you've already gotten a sense of how intentional this program is constructed. It is indeed built very intentionally, and mentoring is integrated in a very comprehensive way and at a very granular level. I'll try and give you a sense of that in the time that we have. Just so you know, we're going to leave out a few things that we could talk about, probably this component of the program in one whole session all on its own, because it really is that central and core. It is done in the spirit of Sawubona, which is a South African term that means I see you. We are committed to seeing fully seeing each and every intern who comes to our program. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. So just thinking about our program historically, we really fully appreciate that historically mentorship has mattered. There's a long history of elder psychologists mentoring those entering into the profession. For myself, you may have seen her picture, in fact, in that large annual dinner photo. My first Black woman mentor in psychology was Jessica Henderson Daniel. I met her when I was a junior in college, thinking about graduate school, and she was an early career psychologist, an ECP. We happened to attend the same church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And after church one Sunday on a church pew, she talked to me about graduate school and about becoming a clinical psychologist, and in particular, a child clinical psychologist. She was literally who I wanted to be when I grew up. So I know the value and how precious it is to have mentors and to have that kind of affinity with a mentor. As psychologists of color, more of us join the field. This bringing voice and visibility to those who are left out of textbooks was really, really important in the curricula of mainstream psychology. Mentors were important for doing that, and psychologists of color have been committed to that for many, many years. CMTP originates back to 1972 from a small group of professionals who were committed to serving the underserved and changing the discourse around how these populations were viewed and treated. And the faculty now have a commitment to social engagement, to social justice, and to see this as an integral part of truly understanding the person and whatever mental health concerns they may bring. So applying the social justice lens is essential. It's always relevant, and it's a core tenet of being a multicultural psychologist. Next slide. So indeed, applying that social justice lens fundamentally changes the training landscape. It is a transformative model that demands both personal and professional examination and commitment. We are invested in mentoring our interns to be agents of social change, to view their roles as professional psychologists as spaces for facilitating wellness, growth, healing, and change on an individual, a community, a systemic, and a global level. So that mentoring for social change is core. Next slide, thank you. So to do this, it requires a deep exploration of and a development of both the professional and the personal identities of each and every intern. And we as mentors commit to sharing our own personal and professional identities and to our continued growth in those areas. It happens simultaneously with all of the rigorous clinical requirements that are expected of everyone else, anybody entering the field of psychology. Those same expectations hold for our interns. It involves using one's knowledge and expertise to elevate the experiences, voices, and circumstances of those who may share some of our identities and be very different from us in many other ways. So our mentored practitioner scientist model, it's the overarching framework, it's the multicultural container that is strong, yet expansive, and ever evolving. No 2 years have been the same. Of my 17 years of being on the faculty, I must say, there's been a continuous evolution of this program. So mentoring, when we think about mentoring, it's bringing an integration of our personal and professional identities, respecting the intersectionality of who they are, undergirding all of our efforts with the belief that social justice can be interwoven into the fabric of who they become as professionals, and that this is core to being a multicultural psychologist. We as multicultural psychologists are determined to see what has often been ignored, speaking about what has often existed in silence, using our knowledge and expertise to elevate the expertise, voices, and circumstances of those who may share some of our identities and be very different in other ways. and viewing ourselves as activists and exploring what this means, both personally and professionally. Thinking about how we do this in an implicit and an explicit way, to give you some examples. It begins with their very first introduction to their experience of being at CMTP as an applicant when they're interviewing. We introduce them very, very early, and we're very clear about, we want to know, who are you? How do you identify? The table where they're seated, except for COVID, we ask them to look around that table to note what a multicultural space it is. We ask them to look at our internship faculty members, and we assure them we didn't assemble that faculty for them just for their interviewing experience, but that we look like this all the time. Asking them to take in the table, take in the screen. We voice our commitment to seeing what has often been ignored, to speaking to what has often existed in silence, to committing to discomfort and growth. You'll hear that discomfort quite a bit here. Now, in terms of what's implicit and explicit, their first primary supervisor is intentionally a cultural match. The second primary supervisor for the second half of the year is an intentional cultural mismatch. And for some interns, one or both of these circumstances is very new for them. They may never, if they're a Black, someone who identifies as Black, they may never have had a Black mentor or supervisor. And so for some of our white interns, having a Black mentor or supervisor may be a novel experience. One of the ways that this has factored into the mentoring experience and in terms of the clinical sites, in years past, I've had a Black supervisee or mentee who in her program wanted to start a group for Black men, a treatment group in the setting where she was, which happened to be a forensic setting, certainly not in terms of staffing, not predominantly administrators or staff of color. There was quite a bit of resistance to her starting this group. So in our mentoring time, our weekly mentoring time, she would be parsing out her feelings about this, her strategies around how to address some of the concerns that were being brought to her, how to not give up on what she felt was a really important endeavor that was important for, this was an all-male facility, for the men in that facility, and that she really wanted to pursue this as a part of a training experience for herself, as well as something she wanted to provide. Having that mentoring experience with a supervisor, with a mentor who shared her affinity was really important for her to unpack her feelings, to think through the elements, all the multicultural elements that were coming into play as she pursued this. For the second half of the year, she had the mismatch, and that of course gave her access to a different dialogue. I can say now I have a mismatch. This is the second half, and I have a mismatch experience with the supervisee who is struggling on one of her sites with a supervisor-supervisee relationship that has been difficult this year. She began the year with a cultural match. And so with the white supervisor and mentor at CMTP, there was one conversation that she was able to have in a way of affinity. The second half, she actually has me. And so we can talk about those cultural issues in a very different way, sitting with someone who shares the affinity of the supervisor with whom she's struggling. But it allows for the dialogue to be elevated, to be thought about, to be parsed out in a very different way because of our identities and our willingness to lean into that conversation at that level. The respectful, non-hierarchical part of the mentoring experience, we are constantly growing. We're constantly exploring our biases, listening and learning about how interns define themselves, being open to exploring the path with the mentee that may be different from the path that we may imagine for them. The goal is not to produce mini-me's. It truly is to produce multicultural psychologists who fully realize the work, doing the work through their own lens of identities and their own ability to see others fully when they are with them. It is bi-directional. We learn from our mentees. They learn from us, and we certainly learn from them. What don't I know is always a question to be asked. We have to be open to feedback and the messiness of each new cohort in terms of getting to know them getting to know us, allowing ourselves to discover and learn from the journey that each intern envisions for themselves. And I can tell you that some of this happens in those weekly mentoring meetings, which are intern-led. The agenda is set by our interns. The topics that are raised are very, very broad in terms of their range. Some are where the interns share their content expertise with us because this is something that they find of value and that we certainly do find of value. We are often challenged by our interns we're often challenged particularly in the late spring. We find there's a time in the year where interns plant a stake and some aspect of this meeting time, they take us to task in terms of who owns the meeting, who sets the agenda, what they feel is being addressed adequately, what they feel is not being addressed adequately. Raising those issues becomes central, but all kinds of topics sometimes that they feel they want to cover, who has the power to set agendas. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit as well. And prioritizing growth, learning, voice, and agency. We cannot emphasize enough how important it is that we commit to discomfort for the sake of building stamina, to remain in connection, to listening and learning, to resisting the strategy of disconnecting our intellect and our feelings, for all of us to sit in the discomfort to work through difficult circumstances versus shutting down and moving on. There's an example that I would ask my colleague perhaps to share if there's time, which there might not be time around our holiday party conversation. We may get to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to very, very quickly hit the last points before turning it over to Dr. Vibert. There's the weekly mentoring and supervision. 90 minutes every week is devoted. I should say the mentoring supervision is 60 minutes. That's an hour of mentoring / supervision every week with your primary supervisor. At the very last one, the weekly mentoring meetings, 90 minutes every week we devote to the mentoring meeting. Lots of time for in-depth conversations and discussions. The bio and identity presentations, every faculty member and every intern does a bio presentation. The faculty members go first, so we model it. It is a time of vulnerability. It is a time of sharing what's core of what makes you, you, talking about all parts of your identity you get to include or to leave out, whatever you determine. But we encourage interns to lean into that. It is oftentimes a very emotional process, not only for faculty, but for interns as well. And then there's the identity dialogue, which is once a year, usually happens on a Saturday for about 3.5 hours, which is a very interactive conversation with elders, a panel of elders that includes a reflection time with the current interns, as well as some discussion and commentation and reflection from those in our wider multicultural professional network who attend that meeting. I'm going to pause there and transfer the mic to Dr. Vibert. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Shifting gears a little bit in the last remaining time before we get a conversation underway to think about evaluation and evolution. So how do you evaluate something that's forever underway? And we don't have all the answers. This is very much a work in progress, and perhaps some of you may be able to help us think even more about this, because it's a challenge. We want to move beyond awareness, or what we might hear termed wokeness, to assess tangible individual and group behavior change in everyday training and patient care contexts. For psychologists, that means behaviors around dealing with emotion and dealing with behavior and dealing with cognitions. So we want to be able to demonstrate and see in ourselves and our interns an increased ability to be flexible, rigorous, and understand the nuances of multicultural thinking, empathy, behaviors, and self-reflections. And I think one of our central questions is, how do we hold interns, faculty, and our entire program accountable for creating the multiculturally informed and responsive environment that we profess to aspire to? I think probably a lot of us are familiar now with the organizational DEI data that is in high demand in many organizations as we struggle to make change at a systems level. And that is one set of metrics that are very relevant for our program. But I would say, and my colleagues may add to this, it's probably not our central challenge. Instead, I think both of my colleagues before me have talked about this granular level of analysis that we're really trying to get at, that is inclusive and customized to the individual intern's own journey. Not every intern comes in at the same stage in this work. So customizing our standards for each intern and helping them to think about how they will operate as a professional in a complex healthcare environment like at Boston Medical Center. We also need systems level metrics beyond hiring and retention and policy change. System level metrics that show whether a program is capable of changing and evolving on a regular basis. Okay, next slide. So let's just drill down a little bit at the intern level. What does this look like practically? I think it's fair to say that we engage in a very intense degree of observation of our interns across multiple settings. We are gathering idiographic data at every turn, and we're comparing notes constantly. We're looking for evidence of engagement, specifically around multicultural issues. Can an intern, do we see an arc over the course of the year in the way an intern takes initiative to bring up multicultural conflict or challenges in their clinical work, but also in relation to each other, or perhaps even in relation to a faculty member? Some examples of this might be an intern taking the floor at a mentoring meeting and establishing a topic that's particularly relevant in the moment, socioculturally, or in that intern's personal life. Another way might be volunteering to do grand rounds on a thorny issue related to diversity, or a research topic that explores in depth some level of social disparity in health or access to care, for example. Recently, just this week, we had an intern invite a guest speaker, a colleague of hers, to do a presentation, a unique presentation that focused on theater of color. Very interesting topic, and very relevant to therapeutic work. And what are some of the behavioral sort of things we're looking for that show us flexibility or increased frustration tolerance for conflict, or the ability to move into a place of resolution and problem solving? That might look like an intern moving from a place of hurt or injury relative, let's say, to a microaggression, which happened, and being able to absorb that, express it, but also to move into a place of curiosity about what happened, the ability to perspective take, and ultimately to engage in some kind of repair work. This can look like perhaps for a white intern or an intern who comes with a particular level of privilege, being able to monitor and adjust the use of their airtime during conversations, timing and tact in the way they bring issues up with their peers or with a client. It might relate to going beyond the surface. One example recently of an intern from another country who inadvertently engaged in a highly offensive use of a term that was really a macroaggression from a perspective of race, but something that she could not understand herself given her stage of acculturation. And the way that situation played out and how it triggered different reactions from different people in power, her peers, the way we handled it as a group, the need for us to do that in more than one session so that we could honor the many different reactions people had. Those are some examples of how interns demonstrate the way they grow and change during the course of the year. The same standards apply to faculty. We ask our interns to give us rigorous feedback and evaluations throughout the year. Seminars obviously are evaluated. And we are looking at the thematic content of our supervision sessions. When we meet together, we compare that while trying to protect the right level of privacy, but we're also looking to see, is the intern working in supervision to examine these issues in relation to their own work and their own activities as an emerging psychologist. We're also asking ourselves to continually evolve our own identity presentations. Do they grow over the years? And are we increasingly taking risks in those settings to share with our mentees the kind of interior work that we do as a supervisor and mentor to make sure that we're managing our own biases, our own implicit assumptions. And what are we doing in our own professional lives around advocacy, and how are we sharing that with our interns? How are we modeling? Are we actively engaged in the work we say that we're passionate about? And as Dr. Khan mentioned, this notion of multicultural lens being used in all aspects. As a program, we're monitoring our capacity to change and grow. So I just try to raise a few questions here before we break. How do we, what does our recruitment and retention look like? Happily, as Dr. Khan mentioned, we get a wonderful array of applicants every year, and increasingly they're more and more diverse, and we have been challenged to make sure that our intern pool is widely representative of different cultural, race and ethnic backgrounds and economic backgrounds. And we hold the same standard for the faculty hires. The people that come in to teach in our program are expected to reflect the same thing. We are lucky to have a leader who is extremely skilled in eliciting collaborative leadership and who values deeply the need to share power. So we don't operate as a hierarchical structure like many of our other programs do at Boston Medical Center. We've been given the freedom to really collaborate in ways that I think are quite exciting. What's the health of our program vis-a-vis the organizational structure? How are we contributing to our department in these ways that distinguish our identity as multicultural psychologists? How are we perceived in the academic medical setting? How are we functioning? How are we represented in various professional settings like APA? And I'm happy to report we have wonderful representation there. And how are we doing with our community partnerships? How are we nurturing our network of mentors from the past and our network of new psychologists? And how are we using that talent to forward the goals of the program? How have we met the sociocultural moment of each year? And this was a year like none other, right, with COVID. How did we do with that? And what can we learn from our interns about the lessons to take with us and reframe in the coming year? What are the products that we've produced to show the world what we do and to make a difference in the public square and the conversations we're having? So a series of Black Lives Matter panels was a great example of that this year and years past. Oh, we also, some of the interns produced a wonderful video on vaccine hesitancy among the Black community and a special message from Black providers to be able to make that a meaningful and relevant message. And in the past, things we've written or pieces we're working on to get out into the public domain. And we have a colleague who last night used a term that I will never forget. She called it diversity puffery. We want to be working at an impact level that's way beyond show and puffery. And we need to prove that year after year. The position paper will be edited. It will change as time goes on, and we will be redefining what growth looks like in coordination with our interns. I could just go to the last, I think it's the last slide. So these are some of our key values as a program, as a system. And I would probably underscore innovation. I would even maybe call it obsessive capacity to reflect and constantly be asking questions about our own biases, our own flexibility, our own ability to learn and change in the area of multicultural thinking. And I think that may be it. Thank you for your attention.
We are totally open to comments, questions. We look forward to engaging with you on this.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing a lot about your program and how it's evolved over time and how it continues to evolve to stay relevant with the clients that we serve and the trainees that we train. So yes, if folks have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, and we'll certainly be paying attention to the chat as well. I know some folks had to log off because it is the top of the hour for some, but yes, we're open to questions. A question I do have for you is with the area, oh, someone wrote, I'm speechless because this is also amazing. So thank you. A question I do have is how do you lean into working through conflict? Because that could create a stall, a rupture, yeah, a lot of difficulties. And so I'm curious if you can maybe share from an example of how you've tried to facilitate dialogue when it's erupted in a conflict.
Well, I think you just opened the door for a great example that we started to kind of edit in terms of what we presented. So we'd have time for some Q&A, but I'm wondering, Dr. Vibbert, if you want to share the holiday party example, because we certainly had to work through the conflict that came after that party. And of course, this was pre-COVID when you could still do those in-person gatherings.
Yeah, we have an annual holiday party, and we have a tradition that we've had for many years about gift giving, and it's called the Yankee Swap. And this led to a discussion during the party that wasn't exactly planned, but that got started. I think Dr. Khan encouraged us to explore it around that where that term comes from, what it means. And I happen to be from Yankee background, so I got engaged in that conversation, and it led to a couple of problems. And one was airtime. It went on too long. Another was, it was kind of a reverse thing where you had a white person describing something that felt offensive to them, terminology, and actually does have a kind of derogatory history if you really think about it. But then this led, it was a social situation. It was, the expectations of the interns were quite different than what we got involved in talking about. Some dominated more than others. There was in the mix an offhand, careless comment that one of our colleagues made, also white, that was very hurtful to one of the interns. So it was a disaster, quite frankly. The party was a disaster. And there was a lot of buzz about it the following week. A lot of interns felt hurt, got angry, felt that this was the icing on the cake around some other things that had happened. So it boiled up, and we were compelled to have to deal with it in very direct ways in the middle of interview season, when we had guests arriving every Thursday and trying to put on our best face. So this was really complicated. And you had faculty, myself, very much at the center of it, feeling quite urgent about what I wanted to say, how I wanted to apologize, how I wanted to also open up the space to talk about my own feelings. There wasn't time to do that. So you had, and then Dr. Khan had the understandable reaction of, this was people sort of not paying attention to leadership's guidance in this very delicate moment. So we had a lot to work out. And we have a wonderful faculty member who's very practiced at facilitating these conversations, who got us started. We examined it from many different angles. I think the interns got a lot of space to really explore how they felt about it and practice in a very brave but also safe space how to confront someone like me, a white senior person with a lot of power and privilege. And so it was, that was very rewarding to see and be able to see our faculty support the interns in doing that work. We also, as a faculty, wrestled with our protocol for how do we handle a situation that gets complicated? How quickly? What's the timing? Who gets to lead the charge? So we have to work through some of those conversations. Maybe my colleagues would like to add, but that's the gist of the situation, I think.
Yeah, I think firstly, like just the idea that, one could easily shy away from engaging in a conversation about this topic further, right? They may be, like, okay, let's just sort of bury it and move forward. But the idea for us to think like, no, we need to do something about this. We need to talk about it. And we were continuing to talk about it. Let's bring it to the larger table. It was going to make people uncomfortable, but reminding ourselves that that's what we're supposed to do, right? Isn't that what our idea is? So it's happening right now. Let's do it. And bringing people together, okay, changing what we had planned for the day to make it a priority, because it should be. If that's what your mission and model is, then it needed to be part of the conversation. So changing that, making those decisions as a leader can be tricky because you're changing things around. But and then for me, I think it was just everybody was looking at their own identity and how and where they were in regards to what was taking place, what was coming up for them. And I talked about, age factor came up, and as a leader, being a younger person, and where do you decide to step in and intersect, and what that meant, and leadership of the past, and my own history of understanding leadership from the past, and having a male figure versus being a woman, what that really means and looks like, and how it's received or not received, and putting it out there and being frank about it. And then I think the religious aspect of our identities was coming up for many, what does that mean for me in terms of my own faith? And like, I think both our right faculties were sort of delving into that aspect. Who gets to say what? And when Dr. Wibbert was speaking, I think, one of the interns said, you've had a lot of space as a white woman right now to speak. And it was difficult, but it was just heard in a way. And Dr. Wibbert was so exceptional in responding to it, like, oh, right, I think we have to like delve into our own parts and see what's coming up, what parts of our privilege are playing out, what marginalized aspects are not being highlighted. And we reflected on it on a couple of mentoring meetings after that. And I think it was very useful and very meaningful to be able to do that. And, to not shy away from that and to keep that conversation going. And that's why we say it's messy. There's no perfect way of engaging in it, right? You're not going to reach a perfect resolution in that regard. But people who needed to see things or feel heard, felt heard and seen in what they were trying to share. And everybody was trying to grasp it from the angle of where every individual was coming from. And I think there's beauty in that. And there's, it's difficult and it's messy and it's uncomfortable, but to be able to do that together, it's a good demonstration of, of what we're supposed to be doing as a program. And in the recent years, a lot of conversations about LGBTQI factors has been coming. And I think, historically, program wasn't so good at that, and we're trying to make more and more of an effort of making sure we're using the right pronouns, we're engaging. What is the latest in the field? Are we updated with all of that? Are so we start reading things together and discuss them together as faculty and interns. What have we learned? What did we not know? And owning up to that. We've recognized that, right, how religion and spirituality have often been not a part of the conversation in the same way. So we brought those things up a whole lot, like what's happening in Palestine. Like, do we have space to talk about this? It's happening in the world outside. If we're not in touch with it, like, how do we engage in that? We've collaborated with our chaplaincy program. We have collaborated with the Danielson Institute, which is religious affiliation program within our institution, sort of bringing it and just having joint case conferences so people can hear from other perspectives on how to infuse those within what we're doing. But lots of such things that come to mind. I remember we interviewed an applicant this year, and she was Muslim. And when she came into the room being a Muslim, I said, Salam alaikum, and tears that started flowing from her. Like, with the meaning of being able to have somebody who could understand that or relate to that, or an intern who came and was taken by the fact that they never had a Black supervisor, or someone and another supervisor said, I identify as a butch lesbian. And for an intern to be able to hear that and take that, like, wow, like, this is powerful that somebody can say that. And I can bring that part of my own identity to forward. Those are like some things that come to my mind, but those it's powerful.
Thank you.
Kind of conflict has led to change, just so you know. Those traditions, they're not, in stone. We are open to change and evolving, and to not doing something because it's a tradition. We're just going to keep doing it. So the next holiday party will perhaps have something around gifting, but it won't be that. We will be thinking about new traditions, and we'll be thinking about them differently with the multicultural lens. Who's included, who's left out, whose voice is this a part of? Is there some marginalized identity that is not respected? The multicultural lunches, we were just recently reminded, one of our interns, the last multicultural lunch, which happens on every 5th Thursday. So there are 3 or 4, maybe 5 during the year. But the last multicultural luncheon happened to happen during Ramadan. And we have 2 people who observe Ramadan in our program. We have Dr. Khan, who's identified as Muslim, and his intern. They both chose to participate in the luncheon, to break their fast, to not fast on that day, to participate in the luncheon. Maybe a week or 2 ago, the intern spoke during a mentoring meeting about what the cost was to her, and that there was no recognition, that it would have been meaningful to her had someone asked about how this felt for her, to have, to participate or to not be able to participate in a part of the program during a part, given that that's an important part of her identity during a time that is very sacred for her and important for her. And for that not to have been given recognition or to have been spoken to, that this was not okay in a multicultural space. And that was really an important discussion for us to have. It was important for her to bring to the fore, and for us to consider. And what will happen in the going forward is there will always be thought given to whose tradition. If this is happening during Ramadan, we can make that adjustment. We just hadn't thought about it. And so we all have our unconscious bias, our biases, in this, whose traditions are centered, whose are marginalized, is always something we're constantly having to learn and grow and confront. And we're open to doing that.
I also think that, we have a colleague who talks about how multiculturalism does, and the conflicts that ensue don't really the way to really work them out is in relationships, right? So too often, I think, in our educational world and maybe our personal worlds, we devolve to labeling, we devolve to categorizing. So, that was a microaggression, that was white fragility, that was implicit bias, we're very good at the labels. What we're not so good at is setting aside the label and staying in connection with the person who's injured us or who has disagreed with us. And that's what we work on, because that's the quintessential skill we need as psychologists. That's exactly the laboratory we want to be working.
And yes, the interns do have time, not with faculty, when they can process with each other, bond as a cohort, have their own discussions, their own points of conflict, and their own ways of being. There's a time that we call peer consultation. And it happens regularly, because otherwise they're in their own sites all the other days of the week. Thursday is the day when they're all in one space together at the program, where they have seminars, where we have the mentoring meetings, at the time, one-on-one time with the mentor, and where the whole cohort is in one space.
Thank you so much. There are additional questions, and I'm going to save them, and I'll share them to this presenters by email. If you could maybe respond to them so I could share that then with folks who attended today, I think that would be helpful. I'm sad to say that we are out of time. We've learned so much from you. There's certainly been some thank yous for presenting today what we've learned from you and how you've done this so well at your program and how you continue to learn and evolve. And I think that's just a lesson for all of us. So with that, I think we will end today.